Chapter 13. Kathy McChesney called me at work and asked me to come down to the police station and pick up my jackhandle and some other things of mine that she had. The scrapings from the jackhandle had been tested at the lab and they were not blood. I had taken so much time off work lately, I asked if she could bring them to me, but she was insistent that I come down to the police station. When I got there, she explained that her boss, Captain Mackey, had something he wanted to show me. We went into his office with two other detectives. Mackey showed me what they had figured out from Ted's oil company credit slips. On a large pad of paper on an easel, Mackey had diagrammed the locations from which young women had disappeared in Colorado. On the next sheet, he had made a list of credit card slips from Colorado with Ted's signature. On a third sheet, he had put the two together and showed that Ted had been to each location when the women had disappeared. I was stunned. Mackey told me that the license numbers on the slips varied. I remembered the visit Ted had made when the license plate of his VW was loosely propped up inside the car and told Mackey about it. Mackey told me all this was highly confidential information, and the only reason they were telling me was that they trusted me and wanted to impress on me the gravity of the investigation. Next, they wanted to probe my sex life. I had discussed it with Hirschmeyer, with Kathy, and with the two detectives from Utah, and now I was expected to go over it detail by detail again with these three men I hardly knew. My face was on fire. I stared at the floor, completely humiliated, as I answered their questions. How often? Where? When? What positions? Where are his hands? Where are your hands? Oral? Anal? Bondage? When it was time to go, I could barely move. I asked Kathy for my jackhandle. Sorry, she said, we still need it. That night, Kathy called me at home to tell me that the Seattle Times was going to publish a story the next day regarding Ted's travels to Colorado and the murders there. She said a reporter had walked in right after I left and asked if his story was correct. What else could Mackey do but say yes? I found that hard to believe. I felt that I had been set up, and I was sick of being manipulated. I was sick of thinking about anal rapes, strangulations with nylon stockings, beautiful, healthy daughters torn away from their families. The world was a sick, sick place, and I was profoundly sorry that I had brought my beautiful, innocent child into it. When I looked in the mirror, I saw in my own reflection a similarity to the women who had died. The long brown hair, the pierced ears. Did they die because they looked like me? Ted wrote to me, "My conscience is clear, and my will to clear myself is strong. I cannot sense guilt which is not mine. Liz, I know myself as no one else can, and I know I love people and life too much to destroy one living thing. This is the knowledge which gives me the strength to stand firm against all who challenge me. The world outside may have changed, but I have not." He seemed so together, and I felt so screwed up. He loved life, but was locked away in prison. I hated life, yet I was free. The newspapers were full of statements from Ted's friends, outraged that this all-American boy was accused of these hideous crimes. I had double-crossed him and couldn't live with my conscience. I needed help. Two friends of friends had recommended the same psychiatrist, so I reluctantly made an appointment to see him. He asked me what I wanted from counseling. This threw me for a loop. There was nothing I could hope to gain from therapy. Everything was cast in stone. I dragged myself to the psychiatrist for several sessions because I didn't know what else to do. He suggested that I no longer have anything to do with either the police or Ted. He felt it would be impossible for me to have any peace of mind as long as I was being pulled in two directions. I told him I would have to think about it. That same day, Kathy called and asked if I would come down to the police station and look at a shoe that had been left at the site where two young female hitchhikers had been found with their throats slit a year ago. I told her that my shrink had told me not to talk to the police or Ted anymore, and I didn't want her to call me again. She said she understood my need to protect myself, but she asked if they would be able to count on me later if they needed my help. I told her I didn't know. On Thursday night, November 20th, I got a phone call from Ted. "Hi, guess where I am?" he said brightly. "I'm sitting in my attorney's office. When I walked over here, it was starting to snow. It was so cold and fresh. I'm free." He had been released on bond, but he didn't want to talk about the details. He told me he was going to have pizza and beer and more pizza and beer until he had his fill. Hearing the happiness in his voice made me happier than I had been in a long time. Over the next few days, we talked and talked on the phone. My phone had developed an annoying click just about the time that Ted had become a suspect. I wondered if it was tapped, but I told myself that I was being paranoid. Finally, it got so noticeable that I asked Kathy if the police had done anything to my phone. That would be illegal, she said. I knew that, but she hadn't answered my question. In the back of my mind was the psychiatrist's advice to stop all contact with Ted, but Ted was so full of loving words. He told me that being in jail had taught him that the most important thing in his life was his love for me. I ate it up like a ham sandwich. November 24th was Ted's birthday, and I called him at the house in Salt Lake City where he was staying with friends from the Mormon church. Since he wasn't home, I left a message for him to call me, and when he didn't, jealousy took over again. He had mentioned a friend named Kim that his parents stayed with when they were in Salt Lake City. She had been a great support to him and had done errands for him while he was in jail. They had been just friends for about a year, he told me. As an afterthought, he told me that she was his lawyer's secretary. I tried to be mature when he talked about her, but when I couldn't reach him on his birthday, maturity went out the window. When he finally called, I was upset. "For God's sakes, Liz, this is no time for jealousy," he said. "I need all the support I can get right now." He told me he had been invited to 4 different Thanksgiving dinners. I had sent Tina to Utah for 10 days, and I was lonely. When he asked me what I would be doing at Thanksgiving, I tried to sound perky, as I told him I was going out with friends, hoping to make him jealous. On Thanksgiving Eve, I ran into Captain Mackey at the liquor store. I waved at him across the room and left before he could ask me how come I wouldn't cooperate with the police anymore. On Thanksgiving Day, my skiing buddy Len came to my place and we watched football and drank wine until it was time to meet Angie and her friend at Horatios, a restaurant on Seattle's Lake Union. I went into the bathroom to wash up, and when I came out, Ted was standing in my kitchen. Len, who had let him in, was standing in the dining room glaring. Ted looked pale and upset. I threw my arms around Ted. Gradually, he relaxed, and we rocked back and forth. "Why didn't you tell me you were coming?" "I was afraid you'd tell me not to," he said. He looked so vulnerable that I was sorry he was probably right. He told me that he had flown in late the night before and was staying with his friends Aaron and Deborah in the Magnolia district. He asked me not to go to dinner at Horatios, but to stay with him. "It's important," he said. "I need to talk with you." I didn't want to stay with him. I was a little bit scared. I told him to call me later. "No, it's now or never." His voice was shaking. He walked towards the front door. "Look, take the extra key to my car and go back to Aaron and Deborah's. I'll call you when I get home." I didn't want him to go, but I didn't want him to stay. He told me he had his friend's car, but I insisted he take the keys to mine to guarantee he'd be back. At Horatios, I drank most of my dinner and barely touched the food. Angie was the first to spot him, Ted pacing back and forth in the lobby, staring at us. I didn't know what to do. I went out and asked him to leave. Then I went to the ladies' room, and from a payphone called my psychiatrist. He was away, and his answering service put me in touch with another doctor who advised me to call the police. But the last thing in the world I would do was call the police on Ted. Again. When I came out of the ladies' room, he was gone. We finished dinner, and Len took me home. He came in and checked the apartment to make sure Ted wasn't there. He offered to stay with me, but I sent him away. Ted called from a phone booth and asked if he could come over. I suggested we meet somewhere for a drink. We agreed on Horatios again. I called Angie and told her what I was doing. I was surprised at how strongly she objected. "I must see him one more time," I told her. I was lying, even to myself, to think this would be the last time. She made me promise to call her in a while. As we were shown to a table in the bar, I glanced around to see if anyone was staring at us, but no one seemed to be. Ted's picture had been splashed across the front pages of the newspaper since his arrest, and I was afraid he would be recognized. The conversation was strained at first. We stared at each other. He said that he had been afraid that he would never see me again. He asked if it would be okay if he held my hand. We had always been so physical with each other, but now it was awkward. We tried to find things to talk about. Everything was different except for how much I cared about him. We sat sipping our drinks when suddenly a man in a kilt appeared in the bar playing a bagpipe, music much too loud for the tiny room. He stopped right in front of our table and all eyes turned to him and us. Ted and I looked at each other and began to laugh, our attempt to be inconspicuous blown to smithereens. We decided to go on to the Edgewater Inn on the waterfront for another drink. As we walked out into the cool night air, Ted gathered me in his arms and we kissed for a long, long time. He was a part of me, and I was a part of him. Whatever was going to happen to us together. We drove in my car to the waterfront, and I remember parking the car, but the next thing I remember is sitting in the bar of the Edgewater Inn, both of us crying. I knew I was drunk, and apparently we had been in the car for over an hour, but I couldn't remember any of it. A year later, Ted wrote to me about what we'd said that night. He pleaded with me. 1,000,000 times I rehearsed this. I pictured me on my knees begging forgiveness. I was going to tell you what a fool I was for my infidelities, and I am. For now, would it be wrong just to enjoy the love we have and forget everything else? Sounds like I'm asking you to play house, doesn't it? Maybe I am. I'm asking to pretend tomorrow doesn't exist. We'll sit here, drink our drinks, look out across the water, hold hands, just like a pair of carefree lovers, just like we really were so long ago. It's just you and I. No courts, no detectives, no jail cells. For just a moment, I thought of all the people who would be disappointed in me, and I didn't care. I love you, Ted Bundy, I said. I want to be with you forever. After we got back to my house, I called Angie and told her everything was fine, that Ted was going to stay with me, and that I loved him with all my heart and soul. Have you lost your mind, Liz? She asked me. I don't believe this. That man may be a murderer, and you're going to let him stay there? Use your head. I have to do what I have to do, I said. I was offended that she couldn't understand what seemed crystal clear to me at that moment, that if there was the slightest chance that he was innocent, I couldn't and wouldn't let go. We made drunken love that night, and the next morning we stayed in bed till noon, making love, talking, laughing, reading aloud the letters he had written to me from jail. We talked about getting married, but discarded the idea. I was afraid that I was going to be subpoenaed to testify against him, and I was thinking that if I was his wife, they couldn't make me. At last, we rolled out of bed and began a round of doing our favorite things one more time. We strolled down the Ave, doing our version of the bump with our hips. Ted said he was going to call the news hotline at a local radio station and report that Ted Bundy was seen in the University District. Perhaps he would collect the prize for the best news tip of the week. That night, as usual, I called Angie to talk. I was stunned when she told me that she was sorry, but as long as I was going to have anything to do with Ted, she didn't want to have anything to do with me. She said she could not support me while I made what she considered a very dangerous mistake. Well, fine, I said, trying to sound nonchalant, but feeling abandoned. Saturday night, we headed for the laundromat, and when we got there, Ted told me he was going to drop me off while he did some things. What things? I think someone is following me. I want to make sure. As I turned around to look, Ted barked, "Don't look, for God's sakes." I took the clothes out, and he took off up the street in his VW. No one took off after him. After a while, he came back, still claiming that someone was following him, but unable to prove it. We went to the grocery store while the clothes washed. "Damn it, there is somebody following us," he said. "You shop. I'll be back." Again, he took off. He was back a few minutes later, still with no proof. We loaded the groceries in the car and headed back to the laundromat. "Hang on," he suddenly said. We made a sharp right turn down a side street and then a sharp left, then a sudden U-turn that took us back toward the first street we turned on. A black man in a black car, talking into a radio mic, came speeding by us. We fell in behind him, and he pulled into a Safeway parking lot. Ted pulled the car into the Burgermaster lot next door, jumped out, and approached the black man in the Safeway lot. I got out too, wondering what a bullet would feel like in my back. I half expected to see Ted shot, and then thought that if they shot Ted while I was watching, they would have to shoot me too. The man looked surprised. He was writing something on a clipboard. "Who are you? Why are you following me?" Ted demanded. The man didn't say anything. "Are you with the police? Or are you a private investigator?" Still, the man said nothing, but looked embarrassed. "Leave me alone," Ted said. "Just let me be." We went back to the VW and sat there until the man drove away. "You should have stayed in the car," Ted told me. "This could be ugly. He could have been hired by the family of one of the murdered women. They want to see me dead. They may not wait for the courts." He said he had received obscene and vehement hate mail in jail. When we got home, he pulled all the curtains, lit candles, and turned out the lights. He called his attorney and asked him to find out who was following us. Then we had a candlelight dinner. Later we played cards and drank wine by candlelight. Ted had never been a card player until he went to jail. Now we spent hours playing the games he had learned there. Ted's attorney learned that the police were, in fact, following us, and a semi-apology was extended through the attorney. The policeman should have shown Ted his ID when we approached him. The game had rules. Over the next few months, it developed into a war of nerves. The police staked out my house and followed us. They even brought in the police helicopter a few times. When Ted and I stepped out on the porch to go somewhere, so many unmarked police cars started up that it sounded like the beginning of the Indy 500. We would drive down the street singing, "I love a parade," at the top of our voices as 3 or 4 cars followed along behind us. The only things lacking were crepe paper and a tuba. Some days when I was at work, Ted would go jogging in Discovery Park for the mere joy of watching the policeman pant along behind him. One day he came to my office laughing heartily. Detectives Keppel and Dunn had been waiting for him when he left the house that morning. They had fallen in step with him and tried to talk with him, and when he wouldn't speak to them, they followed him down to my office. He had taken a detour into a building on campus that had a restroom with both a front and a back door. He said he hoped that Keppel and Dunn wouldn't wait more than an hour for him to come out. Ted took me everywhere with him now, and that was what I had always wanted. I knew he needed me as a sort of cover to counteract the image of freak he had been given by the press, but I was willing to play whatever game it was if I could stay by his side. He kept telling me how much he loved me and how important I was to him. But nothing had really changed. One night we were at Aaron and Deborah's drinking beer and eating chicken enchiladas when Ted got a long-distance call. I knew it was Kim Andrews, his Salt Lake City friend. He went into the bedroom to take the call, and I marched in right behind him. He paid no attention to me, so I went back into the living room and picked up the phone there. It was obvious from the conversation how deeply they cared for each other. "When are you coming back?" she wanted to know. "Soon," Ted answered. I stormed out of the house and tried to unlock my car, but I couldn't get the key in the lock. Ted came out and asked me where I was going. "Don't talk to me, you asshole," I shouted. Ted looked around nervously to see if there were plainclothes police listening. "Come into the house," he said. "We'll talk." He tried to take me back into the house, but I began hitting and pounding on him. I really wanted to break his goddamn jaw. "Leave me alone," I screamed. "I hate you." Finally, I got the door open, jumped into the car, pulled out, and left him standing in the dust. I thought he would probably follow me, and I wanted to get to my house and bolt the door before he got there. To get from the Magnolia District to my house requires going through a tricky interchange of streets, and in my drunken state I took a wrong turn and found myself heading for downtown Seattle. I pulled over to figure out how I was going to go the opposite direction, and that's the last thing I remembered until I found myself in my garage. I ran into the house. I could tell Ted had been there. I pushed the bolt in place so that he couldn't get back in, even though he had a key. I sat in the dining room with all the lights out. I knew he would be back, and I didn't know what I would do. Soon I heard his key in the lock. He called my name softly and jiggled the key furiously in the lock. I didn't answer, and he kept it up. Finally, I said through the door, "Go away. Leave me alone. I don't want to see you any more." More loudly now, he started begging me to open the door, all the while jiggling the key. Then I heard the key break off in the lock, and at the same time, one of the guys who lived upstairs came to the head of the stairs. "Leave her alone, man," he said. "Fuck off," Ted told him. "Hey, she told you to get out of here. If you don't, I'm calling the cops." "Liz," Ted called through the door, "if I call you from a phone booth, will you talk to me?" I wanted him gone before there was more trouble, so I said yes. 5 minutes later, the phone rang. I let it ring for a long time. I almost had the strength to not answer it. Ted was crying. "The last thing in the whole world I want to do is hurt you," he was sobbing, "but over and over I wound you. Call me in the morning. I don't have anything to say to you now." "Please, Liz, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. I love you so much." On and on he went. Eventually I decided that this man needed me so desperately that I told him to come back and I would let him in. The next day, Ted sheepishly took the lock apart and removed the broken key. I kept it on my keyring for a long time as a reminder of what had happened that night. It was Christmas time again, and we led a parade of unmarked police cars to the Christmas tree lot. Sometimes the police were discreet, but sometimes they followed us so closely as to harass us. They pulled their cars in so close behind us at the lot, I was tempted to ask them to help us tie the tree on the BW. Later, we went shopping on the Ave, and I bought Ted some corduroy slacks and a brown sweater as a combination birthday and Christmas present. Ted had court dates in Salt Lake City, so he began a round of flying back and forth. For traveling, he assumed an alias, Christopher Robbins, from Tina's Winnie the Pooh books. He said that being Ted Bundy in public was just too hard. If he was relaxed and normal, people said he was putting up a good facade to hide his weirdness. If he got upset and irritated with the press or the police, people said he was evil. If he was jovial, people said he thought the idea of murder was funny. I hated it when he was in Salt Lake City. Not only was Kim Andrews there, but I couldn't handle being alone very well. I had terrible dreams in vivid detail. Once I dreamed I found Tina battered and sexually mutilated. I held her on my lap and cried for help, but the police told me they were sorry. If I didn't help them, they couldn't help me. Another night I dreamed that the killer was at my door, but when I looked out it was Kathy McChesney, so I opened the door. She began to strangle me, and in a flash I realized that the killer had been a woman, and that was why the dead women had trusted her. Then Ted jumped out of the closet where he had been hiding, saved me, and captured the real killer. Ted called me often from Salt Lake. I found it easier to talk with him about certain things on the phone. Why had he gone to Colorado? How come he never told me about going to Colorado? At first he said he couldn't talk about it over the phone. I told him not to come back to Seattle unless he was willing to give me some answers. When he did return, he talked about Colorado with great reluctance. He told me that he wasn't doing well in school and that long drives gave him a chance to think about what was going wrong. He hadn't told me because he thought I would be angry that he was spending time away from classes and because it was costing him money that he sometimes borrowed from me. On New Year's Eve, we were home before midnight. Ted was already asleep, but I was still up when, shortly after midnight, there was a loud boom and the lights flickered and went out. The George Jackson Brigade, a radical group, had blown up a power substation near my house. The whole world had gone berserk. When I was a little girl, I had been very upset to learn in Sunday school that someday Christ was going to come back to earth and that it was going to be the end of the world. I sat down in my dark house those first few minutes of 1976. I figured now was as good a time as any. Some of our worst chases with the police occurred when Ted was trying to leave town. He really disliked the idea of having his comings and goings monitored. He liked to take the 7 a.m. non-stop flight, so the night before he left, he would try to throw the cops off his trail. One night, we got caught up in a particularly desperate chase. Ted wanted me out of the car, so he screeched into my alley, pushed me out, and roared away. It was pitch black in the alley. The car that had been following us hadn't come into the alley, and I started to imagine that the men had left the car and were in the alley or in my garage watching me. As I crept up the side of the garage towards the house, my eyes straining to make out the shadows, I suddenly realized that the police would like to see me dead. I could see the headlines. Bundy girlfriend found strangled. Bundy charged with first-degree murder. I started to run, feeling imaginary hands grabbing at my ankles and reaching for my neck. When I got into the house unharmed, I knew it was only my mind tormenting me again, but still I couldn't stop shaking. One night when Ted was in Salt Lake City, I got a phone call from a man who identified himself as a Seattle police officer. He told me he was calling because he was a Mormon. I checked him out in my church directory and called him back. He told me he hadn't been involved directly in the surveillance, but that he had heard it was getting pretty rough. He said there was a chance I might get hurt if I continued to be involved in the chases with Ted. He asked me to do what was right, to live by church principles and be a good girl. The only thing I could say to him was that he didn't understand. After his phone call, I felt tremendously guilty. Guilty of not living up to church standards. Guilty of what I had done to Ted. Guilty of not being a good daughter. Guilty of being alive. As the trial approached, Ted spent more time in Salt Lake City. After having put him on a plane, thinking that I wouldn't see him again until I flew there for the trial, I was surprised to get a call from him one Saturday morning saying he was in Seattle. He had been instructed by his attorney not to contact anyone, but he told me that his free life might be too short to skip the chance of being with me. I picked him up and we spent the rest of the day together. He told me that he had slipped in Seattle to take a lie detector test that could be used in his defense. I thought that was wonderful. When he passed with flying colors, perhaps I would be able to let go of my doubts. When the results came back, they were inconclusive. Chapter 14. Monday, February 23, 1976, Ted's trial began in Salt Lake City. The charge of attempted murder had been dropped. He would be tried for attempted kidnapping. He had waived his right to a jury trial, believing that a judge, being more intelligent and better educated than a jury, would be able to grasp what the hysteria and the press had done to Ted's chances for a fair trial. I made arrangements for Tina to stay in Seattle with the family of one of her friends, and arranged to take a week off from my job so I could go to Salt Lake City. At the last minute, Ted called and asked me not to come. My name had appeared on the list of possible prosecution witnesses when it was issued a month before the trial, but no one contacted me about testifying. According to Ted's attorney, the prosecutors called me a real squirrel. His attorneys were afraid they might try to put me on the stand if they knew I was in Salt Lake City. I was skeptical. Salt Lake City was Kim Andrews' territory, and I knew Ted would have a hard time balancing the two of us. She was to testify at the trial, and Ted had gone on and on about what a great friend she was to do this, and what a sacrifice it was for her to be publicly identified with him. The day she testified, she was identified in the press as a girlfriend of Ted's. She testified that she had spent a great deal of time in Ted's apartment, and that she had never seen a pair of patent leather shoes there, nor had she ever seen him wear patent leather shoes. In early January, I had bought 2 cans of paint with the idea of painting my apartment on weekends. 6 weeks later, I still hadn't finished, so I spent the week of Ted's trial painting. It was the kind of work suited to 6 packs of beer and gave me the reason I needed to drink all day. Ted's trial was big news. I kept the radio on all day, and Ted called me every night and gave me a play-by-play account. Carol Durant testified at length about the man she said had approached her at the shopping mall posing as a police officer. He told her someone had looted her car and asked her to go back with him to the car and check to see what was missing. After she found nothing gone, the police officer asked her to go with him to fill out a report. She had been suspicious of the man, but after he showed her a badge in his wallet, she got into his beige Volkswagen. Half a mile from the shopping center, he stopped the car and snapped handcuffs on one wrist. She resisted, and he was unable to cuff the other wrist. She said she tried to get out of the car. I was screaming, asking him what he was doing, she testified. Then he pulled a gun, a small black one, and said he would blow my brains out. I got out the door, and he slid across the seat after me. I was screaming as loud as I could and scratching him. Outside the car, she said, the man raised a pry bar in his right hand and tried to strike her, but she grabbed his arm. She managed to break free and ran out into the street, where she was picked up by a couple in a car. She testified that she was hysterical at the time. When Ted's attorney, John O'Connell, cross-examined her, she admitted that she wasn't able to make a positive identification of Ted from the photos shown by the police. She also gave testimony that conflicted with her earlier identification of Ted's car and admitted that she wasn't sure whether her assailant had a mustache. Ted had told me that night that Carol Durant was indeed a very frightened young woman who had gone through a terrifying experience, but she was just plain wrong when she identified him as the man posing as a police officer. Next, the older couple who had picked up Durant testified. The woman said that when Durant appeared in their headlights with the handcuffs dangling from her wrist, she turned to lock her car door. That chilled me. It was like dreams I've had where I try to dial the police and the phone won't work, or I try to run away but the ground is turned into a treadmill. Fortunately, Durant had got the car door open before the woman was able to lock it. On Thursday, Ted took the witness stand. He admitted that he had lied to the police and to his own attorney about what he had been doing the night he was arrested. He said that his paranoia about getting caught smoking marijuana had made him say that he had been at a nearby drive-in movie and had caused him to take off in his VW when the patrolman tried to stop him. He had driven for several blocks, throwing out a bag of pot and cigarette papers and leaving the window open to air out the car. He was afraid that getting caught smoking pot would affect his law studies at the University of Utah. This was the first time I had heard this version. I wasn't anxious to analyze his story, but it didn't sound right to me. Of course, I also picked up on his statement that he had driven by a girlfriend's house earlier in the evening, but since the lights were out, he hadn't stopped. Ted was the last witness. I flew to Salt Lake City that Thursday night. Ted met me at the airport with his lawyer friend Aaron. His defense attorney, John O'Connell, had advised him not to go anywhere alone. Ted looked handsome, and his spirits were high. He thought the case was going well, and he and Aaron discussed it endlessly over dinner in a Mexican restaurant. After dinner, we went back to the airport to rent a car for me. Ted and I drove to the university student housing where I was to stay with my former sister-in-law, Julie, and her husband and 2 kids. Tina and I had always stayed close to her dad's family. They were warm and happy people, and they meant a lot to me. Ted went back to his place. We agreed that I wouldn't go to court the next day. We were both worried that I would be identified, and I was afraid that my role in Ted's arrest would come out. The next morning, he called before he left for court to tell me that he loved me. Julie and I sat around drinking coffee and making plans to go shopping. I had just stepped out of the shower when the phone rang. It was Aaron telling me that Ted wanted me in court right away. "What's wrong?" I asked. "I don't know. He just wants you there." I threw on my wrinkled suit with my long wet hair dripping down my back, got a ride downtown with Julie's husband. Aaron met me in the hall, and we slipped into the courtroom and sat down with Mr. and Mrs. Bundy. The prosecutor, David Yoakum, was delivering his closing argument. Ted turned around and gave me a half smile. As Aaron had said, Ted just wanted me there. I had felt as if all eyes were on me when I entered the courtroom, and it was a long time before I dared to look around. Judge Hanson was younger than I had expected. Yoakum was going through the evidence, saying it fit Ted Bundy to a T. He pulled out a chair and sat down on it, pretending to be Ted on the night of the attack, showing the judge how Ted had supposedly put the handcuffs on Liveracci. Then it was O'Connell's turn. Sounding nervous, he told the packed courtroom that the evidence could fit a lot of people, not just Ted Bundy. The publicity surrounding Ted had created a monster, O'Connell said. A monster like things that go bump in the night or mutilate livestock. He hit hard at Carol Duranche's suggestibility. She had picked Ted out of a lineup only because she had already been shown his picture several times. She identified Ted because she thought that was what the police wanted her to do. When he was done, Judge Hanson read the instructions to the jury, even though there wasn't one, and recessed the court until his decision was made. As the courtroom was clearing, Ted leaned over to me and said, "That's Lewis Smith." He said Melissa Smith's father came to court every day and stared at him. The guards frisked Smith every day, afraid that he would try and shoot the man he believed had killed his daughter. I looked at Smith and looked away, sensing the grief beneath his anger. Ted and his attorneys left first. The press was waiting for them. I left with the Bundys by way of a back elevator, and we walked the short distance to O'Connell's office. There the Bundys were greeted warmly by Kim Andrews, a pretty blonde about 24. All I got from her was a piercing glare. When Ted arrived, he didn't introduce me to anyone, just let me sit by myself feeling left out and ugly in my wrinkled suit and uncurled hair. We waited in the lawyer's office because it was thought that the judge might render a quick decision, and Ted had to be available when he did. I spent a lot of time walking around the block or sitting outside on the steps of the building. Occasionally, when I would come back in, Ted would be sitting on the edge of Kim's desk and they would be laughing about something. Finally, it was decided that there was no point in waiting around. Aaron left for the airport to fly back to Seattle, and Ted and I dropped the Bundys off at the home of one of his church leaders where they were staying. Ted and I went over to the law school and ran into a couple of his friends. They discussed how the case was going. He didn't introduce me to them either, and I wandered around the halls reading bulletin boards. When I came back, he told me we were going out to drink beer with his friends. "Do I know you from somewhere?" I said. He told me he was sorry he was so distracted, and that he loved me and never wanted to be apart from me ever again. He kissed me and held me there in the law school hallway. We went off to a tavern, and while Ted was playing pool, one of his fellow law school students asked me how long I'd known him. When I told her that we'd been going together since 1969, she said, "Now, isn't it odd that he's never mentioned you?" Later, alone with Ted in the car, I told him what she'd said and tried to make a joke out of it. He grabbed my hand and said he was sorry, and that if he could only have another chance, he would shout his love for me from the rooftops. His voice was cracking. "I love you," I said. "I'm sorry I brought it up. I know you love me." When we made our next stop at another friend's apartment, he introduced me as his fiancée. His friend told me that he had been interviewed by the police. "They told me you talked to them too," he said. "In fact, they told me some of the stuff you told them. Is it true?" I didn't dare ask him what stuff he was talking about. Ted looked embarrassed. There were questions we didn't ask each other by unspoken agreement. He didn't ask me why or what I told the police, and I didn't ask him about his connection to the crimes. After an awkward silence, Ted said he was sick of talking about police, witnesses, and trials. We left as soon as we could. We went by Ted's place so that he could change clothes and went back to Julie's. It was late and everybody else had gone to bed. Ted and I lay side by side in my bed and held each other. There was no sexual energy in us. I fell into a deep but troubled sleep. Early the next morning, Ted nudged me awake. "Hold me. I'm scared. Hold me, please." His voice was urgent and childlike. I held his head against my chest and stroked his hair. I felt his tears on my body. I couldn't speak. I wanted to be strong and not cry, but the tears slid down my face. We held each other tight and cried until Ted finally lifted his head and looked at me. "Ugh, we need some Kleenex," he said. We were soggy messes with runny noses. We got dressed and went for a walk. It was a cold gray day. We held hands and walked along in silence. I couldn't catch my breath. We stopped and Ted ate breakfast at a place across from the campus. We would have spurts of conversation and abrupt silences. Afterward, we walked back to student housing, then up towards the foothills. When we got to the zoo, Ted wanted to jump over the exit gate and go in, but I insisted on walking around to the entrance and paying the fee. It took 1 minute of watching the animals behind bars to freak Ted out. What a stupid idea. I should have known better, he said. We wasted the day. At Ted's place, there were telephone messages for him. He ripped them off the pad and took the phone in the other room to return calls, leaving me out in the living room with one of his roommates. The guy was friendly and chatty, and I wished he'd shut up so I could tell if Ted was talking to Kim Andrews. Ted got done on the phone and decided to take a shower. The roommate went off to the store. I searched the pockets of Ted's pants, the garbage can, and the closet for phone messages. I was afraid Ted would catch me, but I couldn't stand not knowing who he had called. I didn't find what I was looking for, but I didn't dare ask. We went to a tavern where Ted ran into a couple of people he knew. Julie's husband was there, and we talked for a long time. I called Julie and told her we'd bring home lots of beer and stuff to make tacos. We parked in the grocery store lot, and as we walked together towards the store, I could feel Ted's hand shaking in mine. As we pushed the cart around the store and debated what kind of beer we wanted, he wanted his favorite Mickey's, and I wanted Coors, which you couldn't get in Seattle at that time. I noticed beads of perspiration on his forehead. "Oh, God," he said, "every time I do something I wonder, is this the last time I'll ever do it? Like the shirts that we dropped off at the cleaners. What if I can't get them on Wednesday?" His voice was low and pleading. "I used to take everything for granted, but everything is so important. I love life. If I can't be free, I want to be dead." I took his hand and led him out of the stuffy store into the cold air. We sat close together on a brick planter, not saying anything. I was thinking that maybe he should take the car and go to Mexico. Then I saw that that wouldn't help. Life on the run isn't freedom either. "I want to get drunk," he finally said. "Absolutely roasted. Go finish the shopping. I'm staying here." That sounded like the best idea I'd ever heard, so I threw in some extra beer, and we stopped at the liquor store and got some wine, too. Back at Julie's, we started drinking and cooking with a vengeance. I excused myself briefly. I had to get into my suitcase to find my Valium. Lately, I hadn't been able to take the edge off with just alcohol. I'd tried switching and combining wine, beer, scotch, and bourbon, but nothing worked. A couple of Valiums helped immensely. All of us pigged out on tacos. After the kids were in bed, we smoked some dope. We watched Monty Python. I didn't understand most of it. I couldn't remember when I had taken the Valium, so I took a couple more. When the beer was gone, we started on the wine. By the time Saturday Night Live came on, I could hardly see. I lay across Ted's lap, and he tickled my back for a long, long time. Sunday morning, we got up very slowly. I drove up to my folks' house for midday dinner. Conversation was strained. My folks were horrified that I was still standing by Ted. I loved my parents very much that day for not trying to discuss it. I didn't stay long. I wanted to get back to Ted. I swung by his place and picked him up and went back to Julie's. There was nobody home. We lay down on the couch and kissed. Slowly we began making love, and for a few moments the breathless excitement blocked everything else out and made things seem the way they used to be. As Sunday wound down and Monday approached, the tension grew. We knew the verdict would probably come on Monday. We drank and watched TV and went to bed early. Monday morning, I popped out of a drug-induced sleep to find Ted looking at me intently. "I love you so much," he told me. I started to cry. I didn't want it to be Monday morning already. "Don't cry," he said. "Just know that I love you." He took me in his arms, and we tried to make love, knowing that it really was the last time, but it was pointless. Neither of us could feel anything. It was like being paralyzed. About 9 o'clock, John O'Connell called and told Ted to get to his office immediately. A verdict had been reached. Panic-stricken, I threw on my clothes while Ted phoned his parents. It was starting to snow, and the streets were slick. We stopped at Ted's place, and he ran in to check his slacks. He came running out carrying his jacket, shirt, and tie. He changed in the car, throwing his yellow turtleneck sweater over the back seat. I dropped him off, found a parking space, and dashed up to the judge's chambers where Ted's parents were waiting. Judge Hanson was there, talking with Mrs. Bundy. I wondered how he must feel. Ted and his attorneys came in, gave me a wink and a forced smile as he came through the door. We went into the courtroom and took our seats. They must have turned off the heat in the old courthouse over the weekend because the room was freezing. I recognized a man sitting behind the prosecutor as Captain Police Hayward, The man I had called from Seattle over a year ago. The man who had told me not to worry. The man who had denied that he had ever talked with me. Jerry Thompson, the detective I didn't like, was sitting on the other side of the courtroom. I stared at Ted's back for a long while. He was fiddling with his hair, one of his usual nervous habits. I liked the way his hands looked. Next to me, Mr. Bundy was holding Mrs. Bundy's hand. We all stood up as Judge Hanson entered. After we were seated, the judge asked the defendant to please rise and step forward. I thought I might throw up. Ted and O'Connell stood before the judge. Hanson read the verdict fast. Guilty. Mrs. Bundy let out a soft gasp and broke into tears. As if from outside myself, I saw that I was crying too. Detective Thompson had stationed himself at the entrance to the judge's chambers to take Ted away. There was another officer at the other side of the door. They were going to take him because of all the garbage I had told them. I had tried to tell them I was wrong, but they wouldn't listen. They were so desperate to solve their case that they had taken a man who might be a thief and had made him into a mass murderer. Ted asked if he could have a few minutes alone with his family. As he entered the judge's chamber, the two detectives grabbed him roughly, pulled his arms behind his back, and snapped handcuffs on his wrists. "You don't need those," Ted said through clenched teeth. "I'm not going anywhere." As they frisked Ted, I leaned close to Thompson and said bitterly, "Revenge is sweet, isn't it, Jerry?" I wanted to spit in his face, claw his eyes out, hammer him. But I knew, everyone in the room knew, who was really to blame for this insane finale. I put my arms around Ted and my head on his chest. I'm sorry. I love you." He didn't respond. He was drenched with sweat. His spirit was gone. He was like a dead man standing up. Let's go. Take him down the stairs," the detectives were shouting. I couldn't look as they took him away.